Have you ever been handed the solution to all your family's problems, only to be told you can't use it? That's what it felt like, sitting in that suffocatingly quiet office. The air, thick with the scent of old leather and my mother's funereal perfume, was a heavy blanket I couldn't shrug off. My grief for Grandpa Arthur was a sharp, private ache, a stark contrast to the palpable tension radiating from my family. My father, mother, and older brother David were perched on the edges of their leather chairs, a trio of predators waiting for a carcass to be dropped. They weren't mourning a man, they were waiting on a number. A number that would supposedly wash away years of bad decisions, failed businesses, and the mountain of debt that had become the defining feature of our family landscape. They loved me, I knew, but desperation is a powerful acid. It burns through everything. Mr. Albright, a man who seemed composed entirely of tweed and solemnity, cleared his throat. He droned through the initial bequests, a small donation to the city library, a vintage watch for my father that he barely acknowledged with a nod. I could feel David's leg jiggling next to me, a frantic rhythm of impatience. He had a contractor on standby to estimate the demolition costs of whatever property they were about to inherit. That's what he'd whispered in the car. Then came the moment that split my life into a before and an after. And finally, Mr. Albright said, his eyes finding mine over his spectacles, "To my beloved granddaughter, Cassandra Hale, I leave the entirety of my primary asset, the business known as the Reading Nook, including the property and the building it occupies, at 117 North Maple Avenue." The room went utterly still. The only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. Me? Why me? It was a punch to the gut. I saw the shock ripple across my parents' faces, saw David's jaw tighten. Millions. That's what the property in the historic district was worth. Millions of dollars that were suddenly, inexplicably, mine. A wave of dizziness washed over me. Before I could even process it, Mr. Albright held up a hand. "However," he said, and the word hung in the air like a guillotine, "this bequest is subject to a specific, non-negotiable condition." He called it the 10-year clause. He read the language aloud, each word a hammer blow forging the bars of a cage around me. I was strictly prohibited from selling, leasing, transferring, or using the property as collateral for any loan for a period of no less than 10 years from the date of his death. Any attempt to circumvent this clause would result in the immediate and irrevocable forfeiture of the entire inheritance to the Portland Public Library system. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. My mother let out a small wounded sound, like an animal stepping on a trap. My father's face, which had briefly flushed with vicarious wealth, was now a pale, waxy mask of disbelief. David just stared at me, his eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal. As if I had somehow orchestrated this from the start. As if I had conspired with a dead man to ruin them. "There must be a way around it." My father's voice was raspy, a stranger's voice. "A loophole. You can't just lock up an asset like that." Mr. Albright simply shook his head slowly. "I assure you, Arthur was very clear. The language is ironclad. I advised him on it myself." He stacked the papers with a grim finality, the sound echoing in the funereal silence of the room. He had no idea what he had just done. Grandpa Arthur, the quiet, eccentric man who had always been my only true anchor, had just thrown me to the wolves. He had handed me a beautiful, gilded lifeboat, then told my drowning family that I wasn't allowed to let them on board. As Mr. Albright slid a heavy antique key across the polished mahogany table toward me, I knew. This wasn't a gift. It was a test. And I had the sinking feeling that for the next 10 years, I was going to be the loneliest person in the world. The drive from the lawyer's office was a silent, suffocating affair. The weight of the old brass key in my pocket felt less like a key and more like a stone, pulling me down. I didn't go home. Instead, I found myself parked across the street from the reading nook, watching as the afternoon sun glinted off the faded gold lettering on the window. How long had it been since I'd just looked at it? It was a part of my childhood, as fixed and certain as the sky. And now, it was mine. Turning the key in the lock was a strange act of trespass. The mechanism was stiff, and the click it made as it finally gave way seemed to echo in the empty street. I pushed the heavy oak door open, and the little bell overhead sang its familiar, cheerful chime, a sound so tied to my grandfather that for a heart-stopping second, I expected to hear his quiet, "Be right with you." But there was only silence, a profound, dusty silence. The smell hit me first, a potent cocktail of old paper, binding glue, and something that was uniquely Arthur, pipe tobacco, and Earl Grey tea. It was the scent of every happy Saturday of my childhood, a time when the chaos of my own home would melt away the moment I stepped over this threshold. I ran my hand along a worn wooden table, my fingers tracing the grooves and nicks, each one a story. This place wasn't an asset, it was a memory palace. His desk was tucked into the back corner, exactly as he'd left it. A pair of reading glasses sat next to a half-finished crossword puzzle, the pen lying beside it as if he'd just gotten up to help a customer. And there, in the center of the green blotter, was a single folded piece of notepaper. It wasn't in an envelope. It didn't look official. It just had one word on it, in his familiar, spidery handwriting. Cassie. My breath hitched. Was this his final word? A last confession? With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper. The letter wasn't long, but every word carried the weight of a lifetime. My dearest Cassie, it began. If you are reading this, it means I've finally misplaced my library card for good. Do not be sad. A life spent among stories is a life well lived. I have left you the shop. I know your family will not understand this. They will see land. They will see bricks and mortar. They will see a dollar sign where a heart should be. I need you to see what I saw. The words began to blur through my tears. This place was never a business to me, not really. It was an anchor in a stormy world. It was a refuge. For me and for you. I watched you grow up in these aisles, finding worlds to escape into when your own was too loud. I didn't leave you a burden, child. I left you the anchor. I left you the refuge. The 10-year clause is not a cage. It is a shield. I only ask that you take care of this place. Let it be for others what it was for us. I sank into his old, creaky leather chair, the letter clutched in my hand. It was all there. He knew. He knew the pressure they would put on me, the guilt they would wield like a weapon. He saw it all coming. The clause wasn't a punishment, it was a protection. He wasn't locking me in, he was locking them out. He was giving me a decade to get strong enough, to build a life they couldn't dismantle for a quick payday. A wave of love for him so powerful it stole my breath, washed over me. The heavy stone in my pocket was a key after all, and it had just unlocked the one thing I needed most. A purpose. I spent 2 days in the quiet, dusty embrace of the shop, doing nothing more than breathing in its history. I'd sit in my grandfather's worn leather chair, his letter a permanent fixture on the desk, its words a mantra against the coming storm. I knew they would come. It was only a matter of when. The cheerful chime of the bell on the third day announced their arrival not as a surprise, but as an inevitability. My mother, father, and David walked in, their faces arranged in masks of strained helpfulness. "We came to help you sort things out, honey," my mother said, her eyes sweeping the room, But what she saw wasn't comforting clutter. It was an inventory of obstacles. David was already running a hand along a bookshelf, his expression the one he used when calculating the value of something he intended to gut. Wow, it's even bigger than I remembered. A lot of wasted space, though. He wasn't wrong, if you considered stories and imagination to be a waste of space. They flitted around the shop under the pretense of tidying up. My father picked up a first edition of a book he would never read, whistling softly at the price printed in pencil inside the cover. My mother ran a finger through a layer of dust on a shelf and sighed dramatically. This wasn't help. It was an assessment. It was a strategic probing of the fortress walls before the siege began. Every comment was a small, sharp tool designed to chip away at my resolve. Finally, David leaned against the front counter, crossing his arms. The pretense dropped away like a cheap coat. "Cassie, we need to be serious. We got another notice from the bank this morning." I steeled myself, my hand resting on the desk, near my grandfather's letter. "David, the will was very clear." He scoffed, a short, ugly sound. "Cassie, it's just old books. It's paper and ink. Do you know what this property, this land, is worth in today's market? We're talking millions. Enough to solve everything. For all of us." The phrase, "just old books," landed like a slap. It was a desecration of everything this place stood for, everything my grandfather was. My father stepped forward, playing the peacemaker, the voice of reason. "Your brother has a point, sweetheart. Your grandfather was a wonderful man, but he didn't understand pressure, the kind of pressure we're under." My mother completed the trifecta, her voice cracking as the first tears began to fall. "They could take the house, Cassie. Our home. Everything we have." There it was. The three-pronged attack they had perfected over years. David's brutal pragmatism, my father's feigned reason, and my mother's weaponized sorrow. "There has to be a loophole," David pressed on, his eyes gleaming with a desperate hope. "A legal challenge. We could argue he wasn't of sound mind, that he didn't understand the financial implications. He wanted me to help him declare the man who had saved me 1,000 times over incompetent. The man whose words were sitting right in front of me, a shield against this very moment." They stood there, a united front of desperation, their collective misery aimed directly at me. They saw a solution, and I was the stubborn lock on the door. They didn't see an anchor or a refuge. They saw a pile of cash being held hostage by a dead man's sentimentality and his overly sentimental granddaughter. As my mother's quiet sobs filled the silence, I felt the familiar toxic tendrils of guilt begin to wrap around my heart. What if they were right? Was a promise to the dead worth more than the future of the living? To appease them, to buy myself a few days of peace, I agreed. I agreed to sit in another lawyer's office, one chosen by my father, whose sleek, minimalist decor felt like a deliberate insult to the warm, book-lined chambers of Mr. Albright. This lawyer, a man named Henderson with a smile too white and a suit too sharp, exuded an air of transactional efficiency. He wasn't here to honor a man's legacy, he was here to find an angle. My family sat on the opposite couch, a silent panel of judges waiting for their sentence to be commuted. David did the talking, his voice tight with a rehearsed argument about Grandpa Arthur's age, his detachment from the real world, and the fundamental unfairness of the situation. He used phrases like financial hardship and familial duty, making it sound as though I were hoarding a cure for a disease that was killing them. Henderson listened patiently, tenting his fingers. When David finally ran out of steam, the lawyer leaned back, the leather of his chair sighing softly. "I've reviewed the document," he began, his tone smooth and clinical. "And I have to be frank. Your grandfather's attorney, Mr. Albright, did an exceptionally thorough job. The will is, for all intents and purposes, a fortress. The language of the 10-year clause is unambiguous and completely airtight. A collective deflation occurred on the couch across from me. My mother's hand went to her mouth, and my father's face seemed to age another 5 years. Henderson continued, leaving no room for false hope. Any legal challenge based on competency would be a long, expensive, and almost certainly losing battle. The documentation of his sound mind is extensive. Any attempt to sell, even through a complex series of shell corporations, would trigger the forfeiture clause instantly. The property would go to the library. Period. I felt a strange, hollow victory. This was the answer I expected, the answer I almost needed to hear. But seeing their hope so thoroughly extinguished wasn't satisfying. It was just sad. They had pinned everything on this one desperate gambit, and it had crumbled to dust. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city 10 floors below the only sound. I was ready to leave, to retreat back to the sanctuary of the shop. But then Henderson leaned forward, a flicker of professional curiosity in his eyes. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. "It is strange, though," he mused, almost to himself. "I've drafted hundreds of wills. Clauses like this, with such a long and inflexible duration, they're rare. They're not just sentimental. A clause this strong, this absolute, usually has a very specific, very compelling reason behind it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's not just a request to honor his memory. It feels like a defense mechanism, a shield built for a war he knew was coming." Henderson's words, "a shield built for a war," had become a permanent echo in the quiet of the bookstore. They followed me through the aisles and settled in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. It was one thing to honor my grandfather's wishes out of love. It was another to understand that those wishes were a strategy. To truly honor him, I realized, I had to understand the war he was fighting. The real work began in the small, cramped office behind the main counter. It was a time capsule. Stacks of invoices from publishing houses, receipts for utility bills paid decades ago, and half-empty boxes of paper clips. I started organizing, sorting, trying to get a feel for the rhythm of the business. It was my professional habit kicking in, the part of me that helps at-risk teens by first understanding the messy systems that trap them. I was trying to understand the system that had trapped my grandfather into writing such a draconian will. In the back of a deep supply closet behind a stack of faded promotional posters from the 1990s, I found them. A series of thick, leather-bound accounting ledgers. The spines were cracked, and the covers were coated in a fine gray dust. I blew it off and carried a stack of them to his desk. Opening the first one was like opening a secret history, his neat, deliberate handwriting filling every page with the mundane details of a life's work. I started from the most recent ledger and worked my way backward. For the last 10 years, the books were simple, predictable. Income from sales, expenses for inventory, rent paid to himself, a modest salary. It was the picture of a stable, if not wildly profitable, small business. But when I opened the ledger dated 11 years ago, the picture changed. A new entry appeared. A significant 4-figure payment made on the 5th of every month. The recipient was listed as Linden Holdings. I didn't recognize the name. It wasn't a publisher or a paper supplier. I flipped back through the months. It was there. Every single month. A relentless, steady drain on the shop's finances. I grabbed another ledger, this one from 15 years ago. It was there too. For years and years, a huge portion of the Reading Nook's profits was being funneled to this mysterious company. Then I found the last payment. It was dated 10 years and 2 months ago, and after that, nothing. The name Linden Holdings vanished from the books completely, as if it had never existed. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The timing was too perfect. A series of massive payments that stopped exactly 10 years ago. A will that forbade the sale of the property for exactly 10 years. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the reason. My hands felt cold as I pulled out my laptop and set it on the corner of the desk. Its modern gleam a stark contrast to the ancient ledgers. I typed Linden Holdings into the search bar, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The results loaded instantly. It wasn't a business partner. It wasn't a silent investor. The first result, right under the corporate logo, was the description. Linden Holdings LLC, Premier Asset Recovery and Debt Collection Services. My grandfather hadn't been paying a partner. He had been paying off a predator. But whose debt was it? The ride home from the lawyer's office was silent, but this was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the thick, grieving quiet of the funeral, nor the tense, expectant quiet of Mr. Albright's office. This was a weaponized silence. A cold, hard wall of it went up between me and my family. My calls went to voicemail. My texts received one-word replies, if any at all. The war Henderson had spoken of had begun, and its first battle was one of attrition. They gave me a week of icy quiet, designed to let my guilt and isolation fester. Then David showed up. He didn't knock. He just walked into the bookstore. The bell above the door announcing his intrusion with a jarringly cheerful chime. He didn't look at the books or the comfortable chairs. He just looked at me, his face a mask of contempt. "Still playing shopkeeper?" he asked, his voice dripping with scorn. "You know, I thought about it. I finally figured you out." I didn't take the bait. I just continued sorting a stack of poetry books, my back to him. "You're not protecting his memory, Cassie. You're a coward. You're hiding from the real world, from real problems, behind the skirt of a dead old man while the rest of us are out here drowning." The words were designed to wound, and they did. They were a vile twisting of my love for Arthur into a character flaw. I turned to face him, my voice colder than I intended. "Get out, David." He just laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You can't hide in here forever. The bills don't stop just because you've decided to live in a fairy tale." He walked out, letting the door slam behind him, the bell jangling in protest. I stood there for a long time, his words echoing in the quiet space. Was he right? Was my refusal to budge a form of cowardice? But then my eyes fell on the old ledgers still sitting on the desk, and the name Linden Holdings seemed to pulse in my mind. No, this wasn't cowardice. It was a search for a truth they were actively trying to conceal. My parents' approach was more insidious. 2 days later, a thick manila envelope arrived in my mailbox at my apartment. My name and address were written in my mother's familiar looping script. Inside, there were no letters, no notes of explanation, just photocopies. A credit card statement, the balance circled in red ink. A notice from the mortgage company, stamped "past due" in aggressive block letters. A final demand from a personal loan, threatening legal action. It was a carefully curated portfolio of their desperation, delivered to me like a threat. They were making their problems my problems, physically placing the evidence of their impending collapse into my hands. They were trying to break me, to swamp me with a guilt so profound that I would have no choice but to surrender. But as I stared at the stark, ugly numbers on the pages, something inside me shifted. The fear and guilt began to burn away, leaving behind a cold, hard anger. This wasn't just pressure anymore. It felt like a cover-up. And I was beginning to think the 10-year clause wasn't just a shield for me, but a lock on a box they were terrified of me opening. The silence from my family had become a physical presence in my life, a cold house guest who refused to leave. The envelope of bills sat on my kitchen counter, a monument to their campaign of emotional warfare. I was isolated, adrift, and holding a key to a mystery I couldn't solve alone. My grandfather was gone, but his world wasn't. There was one person left who had been a fixture in that world for almost as long as he had. One person who might hold the missing piece. Mrs. Petrova lived in a small, tidy bungalow just 6 blocks from the shop. She had worked for my grandfather for nearly 40 years, a quiet, steady presence with kind eyes and a memory as sharp as a paper cut. When I knocked on her door, she opened it with a smile that faltered slightly when she saw the strain on my face. She ushered me into her living room, a space that smelled of lavender and lemon polish, and insisted on making me tea. We made small talk for a few minutes, the delicate china cups rattling softly in their saucers. She spoke of Arthur with a deep, uncomplicated affection that made my heart ache. Finally, I set my cup down, the soft clink loud in the quiet room. "Mrs. Petrova," I began, my voice unsteady. "While I was going through Grandpa's old paperwork, I found something strange. I was hoping you might know something about it." I watched her face carefully as I said the name. I found years of payments to a company called Linden Holdings. It happened in an instant. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a guarded, shuttered look. Her back straightened, and her kindly grandmother facade dissolved into something harder, something made of marble. It was the most profound, nonverbal answer she could have possibly given me. She knew. She knew everything. "Some things are better left buried, dear," she said, her voice low and even. "Your grandfather was a very private man." Her words were a warning, a clear dismissal. But I couldn't stop now. I was too close. "Please," I begged, leaning forward. "My family. They're putting so much pressure on me to sell. They don't understand. I feel like I'm going crazy, and I think this is the reason why he did it. The reason for the 10-year clause. I have to know." She looked at me for a long time, her gaze searching my face. I think she saw the genuine desperation there, the reflection of the same exhaustion she must have seen in my grandfather's eyes for years. She let out a long, weary sigh, the sound of a secret finally giving up its ghost. "He made me promise I would never speak of it," she said softly. "But he's gone. And you have a right to know who you're fighting." Her story unwound the past like a spool of rotten thread. It started nearly 20 years ago. My father and David, full of ambition and fatally short on foresight, had launched a disastrous business venture, a boutique construction company. They poured everything they had into it and convinced Arthur to invest heavily. When it all collapsed, as it was doomed to do, they weren't just broke. They were facing a debt so catastrophic the bank was days from seizing their home. They came to Arthur, broken and terrified. And to save them, to save the house I grew up in, my grandfather did the unthinkable. He went to a predatory lender, Linden Holdings, and used his only true asset, his sanctuary, the reading nook, as collateral. He took their ruinous debt onto his own shoulders. The huge, regular payments I'd found in the ledgers, that was him. For almost 10 years, every spare dollar the shop made went to cleaning up my family's mess. The room tilted. Every piece fell into place with a sickening final click. The ledgers. Henderson's words about a shield. My family's frantic, ugly desperation to get their hands on the property and sell it. They weren't just trying to solve a new financial problem. They were trying to repeat history. They wanted to sacrifice the shop all over again. The 10-year clause wasn't a strange, sentimental whim. It was a scar. It was a firewall built from a decade of quiet sacrifice, designed to protect the shop, and me, from them. My grandfather hadn't been punishing me. He had been arming me with the one weapon that could stop them. The truth. I walked back from Mrs. Petrova's house through a world that looked the same, but felt fundamentally different. The truth she had given me wasn't a comfort. It was a weapon. A heavy, cold piece of steel I now had to decide how to use. There would be no more hiding, no more quiet suffering. The war Henderson spoke of was about to have its decisive battle, and it would be fought on my ground. I made 3 phone calls, my voice even and calm, my request simple and non-negotiable. Meet me at the shop, 7 o'clock. I spent the afternoon preparing the battlefield. I dusted the front counter until the dark wood gleamed under the soft lights. Then I retrieved the old, leather-bound ledgers. I didn't hide them. I laid 3 of them out in a row, right in the center of the counter, like artifacts in a museum exhibit. I opened the middle one to a page from 15 years ago, a page filled with my grandfather's neat script, and one entry that stood out. The first of many large payments to Linden Holdings. I placed a bookmark there. They arrived together, a united front, their faces a mixture of annoyance and grim determination. They thought this was another negotiation, another opportunity to wear me down. My mother started before she was even fully through the door. "Cassie, this is getting ridiculous. We're your family." Her words died in her throat when she saw the scene. Me, standing behind the counter, calm and silent. And the open books, waiting for them under the lamplight. They approached the counter slowly, cautiously, as if it were a bomb. David was the first to see it. His eyes flickered from the ledger to my face and back again. I saw the flicker of recognition, the dawning horror. My father's gaze followed, and the color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor. They stood there, trapped in a silence so profound it felt like the end of the world. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I let the silence do the work. Finally, I looked directly at my father, then at my brother, and my voice was a quiet, steady thing that cut through the stillness. "Do you remember this?" I asked, my finger resting gently on the bookmarked page. The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly devastating. The lie they had constructed their lives around for 2 decades had just been laid bare on a dusty old counter. In their eyes, I saw it all. Shock. Panic. But beneath it all, not a shred of remorse. What I saw was the raw, ugly shame of being caught. The silence shattered, but not with the sound of an apology. It was my father who broke it, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He pushed himself away from the counter, taking a step back, as if to physically distance himself from the evidence. "So what?" he finally snarled, the words thick with defiance. He wasn't looking at the ledger anymore. He was looking at me, his eyes blazing with a desperate, cornered fury. "It's true. Is that what you wanted to hear?" My mother began to sob, but these weren't the soft, manipulative tears from before. These were harsh, ugly gasps of humiliation. "Cassie, how could you? To throw this in our faces now!" She made it sound as if my discovery of the truth was a greater crime than the truth itself. As if I were the one who had betrayed them. The sheer audacity of it, the twisting of victim and aggressor, was so profound it left me breathless. Then my father's voice rose, filling the dusty, sacred space of the bookstore with a rage born of pure shame. "We made a mistake from 20 years ago. Do you have any idea what we were going through?" He threw his hands up, a gesture of exasperation, of a man utterly wronged. "Are you going to stand there on your high horse and punish us for the past while our present is going up in flames, while we're about to lose everything all over again?" It was then that I saw it with a chilling, absolute clarity. They hadn't learned a single thing. He wasn't apologizing for the past. He was angry that it was inconveniencing his present. And then came the final, unforgivable blow. "Your grandfather was a stubborn old man." He spat, the words dripping with a resentment that must have been festering for years. He held onto this place out of some foolish sentimental pride when it could have saved us all so much pain. Don't you dare repeat his mistakes. He called Arthur's sacrifice a mistake. He called the decade of quiet, relentless payments that saved his home a mistake. In that single, terrible moment, I understood. They weren't asking me to help them. They were asking me to repeat the cycle. They were asking me to put the shop on the altar and sacrifice it, just as he had done, to save them from themselves once more. They didn't see the irony. They didn't see the monstrous nature of their request. They only saw a solution, and my refusal to destroy my own anchor for their sake was, in their eyes, the ultimate betrayal. They left. The final slam of the door was a gunshot in the quiet, dusty air, and the little bell overhead gave a frantic, broken jangle. In the silence that followed, I expected to feel devastated. I expected to crumble. But the feeling that washed over me was something else entirely. It was a strange, terrifying calm. The kind of calm that comes after the hurricane has passed, and you're left standing in the wreckage, realizing you survived. The war was over. I had lost my family, but I had won my freedom. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. The choice was no longer a choice. It was a fact. Their reaction, their complete lack of remorse, their rage at being exposed, it had cauterized the wound. There was no going back, no appeasing them, no middle ground. I looked around the shop, at the towering shelves of silent stories, at the worn armchairs, at the lingering ghost of my grandfather. He hadn't just left me an anchor, he had left me a battlefield, and the enemy had finally retreated. Now, what do you do when you're left in possession of the field? My first move wasn't grand or dramatic. I walked into the back office and found a piece of cardboard from a book shipment. I took a thick black marker, the kind my grandfather used for pricing, and in my steadiest hand I wrote 2 words: help wanted. It felt like the most important thing I had ever written. I walked to the front door and taped the sign to the inside of the glass, facing out into the world. It wasn't just a request for an employee, it was a declaration of intent. It was a signal that this place was no longer a mausoleum for one man's memory. It was a living thing, and it was about to grow. The next day, I started the real work. I began in the storeroom, a place that hadn't seen the light of day in 20 years. It was a daunting, archaeological dig through layers of forgotten inventory and dusty relics. But the physical labor was a balm. Every box of unsellable paperbacks I hauled to the recycling bin felt like shedding a layer of old guilt. Every thick coat of grime I scrubbed from a shelf felt like clearing my own head. The ache in my back and the soreness in my arms were welcome sensations. This was pain I could control, effort that was building something instead of just resisting destruction. As I worked, clearing spaces, letting in light, the ideas started to come. They weren't a flood, just a trickle at first. But they were there. That dark, cluttered corner? It would be a children's nook, with bright pillows on the floor and picture books within reach of small hands. The cramped back office? I could move the desk out here and turn that room into a space for a book club or a poetry reading on a Friday night. I wasn't just cleaning. I was excavating. I was uncovering the potential that had been buried under years of quiet routine and my family's suffocating expectations. This work wasn't just my therapy. It was my way of truly honoring him, not by preserving his world in amber, but by helping it to evolve. Physical labor could build a foundation, but it couldn't buy paint or repair the aging electrical wiring. Hope was not a business plan. My work in the shop had been an act of defiance, but to make it a future, I needed something more. I needed capital. The thought of taking a loan, of putting this place in any kind of debt, felt like a betrayal. But as I was cleaning out my grandfather's desk, I found a flyer for a city-sponsored small business grant for revitalizing historic properties. It felt like a message from the past. The application was a mountain of paperwork. It forced me to articulate my vision, to translate my grief and love and anger into business projections and community outreach strategies. What was my plan? Who was my audience? For nights, I sat in the quiet shop, fueled by coffee and a desperate, flickering hope, trying to convince a faceless committee that a dusty old bookstore was a better investment than another vape shop or boutique cafe. Sending it off felt like releasing a single balloon into a hurricane, a fragile prayer I was almost certain would be lost. The weeks of waiting were a special kind of torture. Every time my email pinged, my heart would leap into my throat. But then, one gray Tuesday afternoon, an official-looking email from the city of Portland landed in my inbox. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely click it open. I read the first line, "We are pleased to inform you," and a sound escaped my lips that was half sob, half laugh. It wasn't a fortune. It was $5,000, but it was the most beautiful number I had ever seen. It was enough for repairs, enough for fresh paint and a new sign, enough for a grand reopening. It was a sign from the world that I was on the right path. I was sitting at the desk, the approval letter clutched in my hand like a holy relic, when the bell above the door chimed. My entire body went rigid. It was David. He stood just inside the doorway, looking out of place amidst the half-organized chaos. He looked tired, older than he had a few weeks ago. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the cleared spaces, the stacks of books sorted for donation, the raw energy of a place in transformation. He didn't speak. He just watched me try to single-handedly wrestle a massive 7-foot-tall oak bookshelf away from a wall so I could paint behind it. It wouldn't budge. I grunted, pushing with all my weight, my feet slipping on the dusty floor. He watched me struggle for a long, silent moment. I was about to tell him to leave when he walked over, took off his jacket, and grabbed the other end of the shelf. He didn't ask. He didn't say a word. He just nodded at me. "On 3, he grunted. 1, 2, 3. We heaved together, a perfectly synchronized movement of shared effort, and the massive piece of furniture slid away from the wall with a deep groan. He helped me shift it to the center of the room, then stood back, dusting off his hands. He still hadn't apologized, but as he stood there, amidst the dust and the promise of a new beginning, he had helped me move the weight. It was the first step. The night of the grand reopening felt like a dream. The scent of fresh paint and new carpet mingled with the timeless, comforting smell of old paper. The little bell above the door, which had once announced intrusions and confrontations, now sang a constant, joyful tune as a stream of people from the neighborhood flowed inside. Old customers who knew my grandfather greeted me with warm, sad smiles, while new faces, drawn in by the bright lights and the promise of something new, looked around with curiosity. I saw them arrive out of the corner of my eye, my parents. They slipped in quietly and found a spot in the far back corner, partially obscured by a tall shelf of biographies. They looked lost, awkward, like tourists who had wandered into a private party. My father's shoulders were slumped, and my mother clutched her purse like a life raft. A year ago, their presence would have sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Now I felt only a distant, complicated pang. I acknowledged them with a small, brief nod, and they returned it. There was no warmth, but there was no hostility. It was a truce. The main event, for me, was the first children's story hour. I gathered a small group of kids into the new nook, their parents standing and smiling around the edges. As I sat on a small stool and opened a colorful picture book, a hush fell over the store. I read the story, my voice growing stronger and more confident with each page. I watched the children's faces, their eyes wide with wonder, their mouths agape at the turn of a page. They weren't just listening to a story, they were living it. In that moment, watching the pure, unguarded joy on those small faces, I finally understood the full depth of what my grandfather had given me. He didn't leave me a building. He didn't leave me an asset. He left me a purpose. He left me a community. This place, the Reading Nook, wasn't just an anchor for me. It was a potential anchor for every person who walked through that door. It was a refuge, not from debt collectors, but from the noise and hardness of the world. It was his greatest story, and he had made me its new author. A year has passed. The shop is more than surviving. It's thriving, a true center for the neighborhood. Poetry nights are standing room only, and the children's story hour has a waiting list. My parents were forced to sell the big house. They live in a smaller condo across town now, and for the first time in their adult lives, they have a budget. They are slowly, painstakingly, climbing out of the hole they dug. The relationship is still fragile, marked by years of damage, but it's honest. They no longer ask me for anything. Sometimes, my mother even comes to the story hour, standing in the back, just to watch. I'm sitting in my grandfather's worn leather armchair now, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside me. The store is alive with the quiet rustle of turning pages and the low murmur of conversation. I look at this world I have built, a world he protected for me, and I finally understand his final gift. The 10-year clause was never a curse. It was the greatest act of love I have ever known. It wasn't a prison sentence. It was the time he knew I would need to grow strong enough to build a life so full and so truly my own that no one could ever take it away from me. A year has passed. The shop is more than surviving. It's thriving, a true center for the neighborhood. Poetry nights are standing room only, and the children's story hour has a waiting list. My parents were forced to sell the big house. They live in a smaller condo across town now, and for the first time in their adult lives, they have a budget. They are slowly, painstakingly, climbing out of the hole they dug. The relationship is still fragile, marked by years of damage, but it's honest. They no longer ask me for anything. Sometimes, my mother even comes to the story hour, standing in the back, just to watch the children. We don't talk much on those days, but her presence is a quiet admission, a white flag waved over a long-abandoned battlefield. She isn't just watching the kids, she's watching me, seeing a daughter she doesn't quite recognize but is beginning to respect. I'm sitting in my grandfather's worn leather armchair now, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside me. The store is alive with the quiet rustle of turning pages and the low murmur of conversation. A year ago, this chair was a throne of grief, a witness stand in a silent trial. Now, it's simply a comfortable place to sit and watch the world I've built. A world he knew I could build, if only I had the time. I look at this vibrant, breathing space, and I finally understand his final gift. The 10-year clause was never a curse. It was the greatest act of love I have ever known. It wasn't a prison sentence meant to lock me in. It was a shield. It was the time he knew I would need to grow strong enough to build a life so full and so truly my own that no one, not even the people I loved most, could ever take it away from me.